My wife betrayed me by sleeping with my closest friend, then had the audacity to try stealing the very company the three of us built from the ground up. Now they're on their knees, pleading for forgiveness. But instead of mercy, I gave them exactly what they earned, a long overdue taste of justice. I'm 38 years old, and this story stretches back to my early college days. Let me rewind the clock a bit to where it all began. Back then, I wasn't exactly the life of the party. Most of my days were spent buried in textbooks, hunched over a keyboard in the computer lab, writing code and debugging scripts until my eyes blurred while most people were out drinking or chasing college romance. I was fine-tuning my programming skills and mapping out what I hoped would become a future in the tech world. Coding wasn't just a course of study. It was my obsession, my way of making sense of the world. I treated every programming problem like a puzzle, one that had to be cracked, no matter how long it took. Making apps, building systems, it gave me a rush, a feeling of purpose. Socially, I was quiet. I had a small circle of people I trusted, but I wasn't what you'd call outgoing. That's when Mia came into the picture. We crossed paths during an economics course I needed to pass, but barely understood. Mia, in contrast, was a picture of confidence and control. She walked into class like she owned the room, always knew the answers, and somehow managed to keep perfect notes in color-coded tabs. I noticed her immediately, but didn't dare say a word. That changed one afternoon in the campus library. I was frantically trying to make sense of my jumbled notebook when she slid into the chair across from me and said with a raised brow, "You're looking at the wrong syllabus." Without missing a beat, she handed me her notes, organized, neat, a masterpiece compared to my chaos, and added with a teasing smile, "You owe me a coffee." And just like that, something clicked. We started studying together regularly, but before long our late-night sessions became less about supply and demand curves, and more about talking, really talking, about life, dreams, ambitions, and the kind of future we both hoped to create. Mia wasn't just smart, she had fire in her. She dreamed big, worked hard, and made you feel like the future wasn't just possible, it was already within reach and was completely taken. At the same time, my best friend Luke had always been by my side. Luke and I had known each other since high school. If I were the reserved tech nerd, Luke was the magnetic people person. Charming, smooth, always knowing what to say and how to say it. We made a great pair. For years we'd shared a dream of starting a company together. Me writing the code, him selling the vision. By the time I graduated, Mia and I were officially a couple. A year later, we got married. Luke naturally stood beside me as my best man, giving a toast that had people laughing and crying in equal measure. That day felt like the beginning of something truly special. I had a brilliant wife who shared my dreams, a best friend I could trust with my life, and the future finally felt like it was unfolding exactly as I had imagined. But reality wasn't so romantic. My first job out of college was at a small tech firm, where I worked long days in a cubicle, debugging legacy systems and saving every penny. Luke landed a flashy sales job, and we kept in touch, meeting up every weekend to keep our business ideas alive. Mia, meanwhile, took a finance position that she openly despised, but she did it to help us stay afloat. After grinding through a couple of years, Luke and I finally decided to bet on ourselves. We quit our jobs, combined our savings, which to be honest barely covered a few months of rent, and launched our own app development startup. Our concept was simple: build mobile tools to streamline everyday transactions, food orders, ticket bookings, local services, basic utilities done better, and a services-centric for us based on daily transactions. We took our skills to businesses, built them better. It wasn't revolutionary, but we were confident we could outshine the competition, with cleaner UX and sharper execution. We set up shop in Luke's garage, working on old laptops, surrounded by second-hand furniture and extension cords taped to the walls. Luke handled networking, meetings, and sales pitches. I focused on the back end, writing line after line of code, losing myself in the work. It was grueling, but we believed in what we were building. Mia stood by us through it all. She cheered me on during late-night coding crashes, listened to me vent about endless bugs, and helped organize our mess of a calendar when we started gaining traction. One night, over a box of cold noodles and an exhausted laugh, she said, "Maybe I should just quit and keep you two in line full-time." We both laughed, but the idea didn't go away. About a year into our startup journey, Mia made the leap. She walked away from her corporate job and joined us as our operations manager. And it was the smartest decision we could have made. She brought structure, discipline, and an eye for detail that Luke and I lacked. While we obsessed over product features and UI design, she ran the business. Budgets, client comms, timelines. The three of us clicked like a precision-engineered machine. We weren't raking in cash, but we were gaining momentum. Every small milestone, an app launch, a positive review, a meeting with a potential investor, felt like a step towards something real. And then we got our first break. One of our apps, a slick, intuitive ticketing platform, caught the attention of a few angel investors. Their funding allowed us to move out of the garage and into a tiny but proper office. The place was humble, flickering fluorescent lights, paint peeling off the walls, barely enough space for 3 desks. But it was ours. We worked like maniacs, often pulling all-nighters, celebrating every victory with dollar store champagne and shared takeout. Mia kept things running without missing a beat. Luke charmed clients and sealed deals, and I kept coding, dreaming bigger with each success. Our office slowly transformed into a real workspace. We added whiteboards covered in scribbles and post-its, brought in a mini fridge for energy drinks, and even had our own little coffee corner. We were scrappy, but every improvement made it feel more real. Each morning I walked in, I felt like I was living proof that persistence paid off. And through it all, Mia was the soul of our operations. She didn't just manage schedules. She enforced discipline, chased down invoices, prepped reports, and even started managing HR protocols once we brought in 2 interns. She was relentless. She kept us moving forward even when the obstacles piled up. I was grateful, beyond words, for her commitment, for how she believed in our dream just as fiercely as we did. Luke, too, had become something of a legend in our local startup scene. He had charisma that made people listen, and his ability to connect with clients opened doors we never could have reached alone. With him as the face, me as the architect, and Mia as the backbone, we were gaining serious traction. By this point, the 3 of us had poured everything into this company, our time, our energy, our relationships. We weren't just building a product, we were building a legacy. But I never saw the betrayal coming, not from them. They were the last 2 people I ever expected to destroy everything we'd built together. We worked insane hours, often well past midnight, but there was a rhythm to it, one that somehow made sense. Our little office was cramped, barely enough room for 3 desks and a stack of filing cabinets, and the air conditioner made more noise than cool air. Still, none of that mattered because the space crackled with potential. It felt like we were on the brink of something transformative. We weren't just co-workers, we were a unit. One with shared vision, mutual respect, and the drive to make something meaningful together. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to change. It started with little things. Innocent at first glance, Mia and Luke began texting more frequently outside of work hours. That didn't raise any alarms at first. After all, we were a startup. Work bled into personal time constantly. But the messages increased. They'd burst out laughing at jokes I wasn't in on, and when I asked, Mia would casually wave me off with, "Oh, just something from the client meeting," followed by Luke's silent nod or half smile. It seemed harmless. We were all close, constantly working side by side. A few texts didn't mean anything. But then came the late-night meetings. Mia began mentioning that she and Luke needed to go over projections or finalize some financial models after hours. The first few times didn't bother me. They were rare, maybe once or twice a month. But gradually they turned into weekly occurrences. Then, multiple times a week. I'd be at home, wrapping up development sprints or debugging back-end scripts while Mia stayed behind with Luke. "We're just trying to stay ahead of deadlines," she'd say. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Luke and Mia were the people I trusted most. They were as committed to the company as I was. I had no reason, no evidence to suspect anything. Yet, the weekend work sessions followed. Mia would tell me she and Luke needed to work through marketing strategies for the next launch. Sometimes she'd come home after midnight, looking emotionally drained and mentally distant. When I asked how it went, I'd get vague answers. "It was fine," she'd mumble, or "We made some progress." At first, I blamed the stress. Startups are pressure cookers. Maybe they were just overwhelmed. But the dynamic between them changed. The easygoing professional vibe they'd always had was replaced by something different, subtly coded. Their eye contact lingered longer than necessary. Their body language felt too synchronized, too private. I tried to brush it off. I wasn't the kind of guy who micromanaged or interrogated the people I loved. I trusted them deeply. But something about their behavior made my instincts twitch. Luke, who had once been my go-to for everything from brainstorming sessions to grabbing drinks after work, started pulling away. He'd cancel our usual Friday hangouts with generic excuses. "Too much going on, bro," or "Let's catch up next week." In meetings, he was distracted, constantly checking his phone or zoning out during critical discussions. He stopped engaging with our design reviews, Even when we talked, it felt like he wasn't really there. Like part of him had already detached. At first I thought maybe he was burnt out, maybe all of us were. But while I felt tired and overworked, I was still present. Luke, though, had turned into a ghost in the office. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Saturday. Mia had said she and Luke were staying late to finalize some last-minute numbers for a pitch presentation. I decided to surprise them with dinner from their favorite Thai spot, figuring they'd appreciate the gesture, maybe even need the break. I arrived at the office a little past 9 p.m. The place was dead silent. All the lights were off except the soft glow coming from Mia's corner. I walked in, bag of takeout in hand, and found them sitting close, far too close, huddled around her laptop. They both jumped when they saw me, like they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't. "Oh hey," Mia said quickly, shutting the laptop with more urgency than seemed necessary. "What are you doing here?" "I brought food," I said, holding up the bag. My voice came out more hesitant than I intended. Luke stood, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Man, you didn't have to. We were just finishing up." The whole moment felt off. Mia looked rattled, her words stumbled. Luke's charm felt forced. The awkward tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. I left soon after, pretending everything was fine, but inside, something broke. The next few days, I couldn't shake the image of the two of them at that desk. I kept asking myself if I was overthinking it, if I was letting my imagination run wild. But no matter how I spun it, something didn't sit right. I told myself it was paranoia. I wanted to believe that. After all, these were the two people I loved and trusted most in the world. I'd built a life around them, a business, a future. But then came the bracelet. One evening, a few days after that Saturday, I was straightening up the living room while Mia showered. As I fluffed the cushions on the couch where she'd been lounging earlier, something fell out. It was a small, neatly wrapped gift box with a shiny silver ribbon. My first thought was that maybe it was an anniversary present. Ours was just around the corner. I smiled, touched by the surprise, until I turned the box over. There was a tag, just a simple one. "Can't wait to see you wear this." My stomach flipped. The handwriting was unmistakably Luke's. I'd seen it on 1,000 whiteboards, pitch notes, and post-its stuck to my monitor. It was his, no question. I peeled back the paper slowly, hoping, praying it was a misunderstanding. Inside was a delicate, stylish bracelet. Silver, understated, and exactly the type of jewelry Mia liked. Not something she'd wear for me. We both knew I was clueless about that kind of thing, but something Luke, with his effortless taste and showmanship, would absolutely pick out. I sat there for a long time, just staring at it. Maybe it was a gift from the team. Maybe it was an inside joke. Maybe they were planning a surprise and I'd just ruined it by snooping. That's what I told myself, anyway. But deep down, I knew. I put the gift back under the cushion, just as I'd found it. I didn't say a word. Not that night, not the next day, not even when Mia smiled at me like nothing was wrong. Because I needed to be sure. From that point on, I started paying closer attention, watching, listening. Their conversations became quieter, more guarded when I entered the room. Mia's phone never left her hand. Luke rarely made eye contact. The energy in the room shifted every time I walked in, like I'd interrupted something. And the worst part? I wanted to be wrong so badly that I kept giving them the benefit of the doubt, over and over. But the signs kept piling up. Mia became more distant. Her affection faded into routine. She stopped asking how my day was, stopped caring about the apps I was developing. She wasn't cold, just absent. Luke, meanwhile, started avoiding me almost entirely. He skipped meetings, bailed on team events, and kept his replies short when I messaged him. It was like he couldn't face me anymore, and I was beginning to understand why. That gift, the one with the bracelet and the handwritten note, hadn't just been a fluke. His confirmation. My world was unraveling, and I was about to learn just how deep their betrayal really ran. Lately, Mia had stopped talking about work entirely, a subject she once couldn't stop raving about. She used to come home buzzing with updates, from new marketing strategies to the tiniest UX changes. But now, silence. Polite, deflective answers replaced her usual enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Luke had all but vanished from our regular group routines. He skipped hangouts with excuses that felt paper-thin, and acted distant on the rare occasions we crossed paths. His energy had changed. He seemed guarded. The two people closest to me felt like shadows of their former selves. A few nights later, as Mia and I sat curled on the couch watching a show I couldn't even follow, the weight of it all became unbearable. My thoughts raced, twisting through a fog of doubt and suspicion. Finally, I turned to her and asked, "Is everything okay with us? You've been different lately." She looked at me, clearly startled. "What?" "Yeah, of course. Everything's fine," she said. But her eyes didn't match her words. They darted away too quickly, and her tone lacked conviction. In that moment, I felt the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything was not fine. The day it all truly came apart started just like any other. I still hate that morning. The way it smelled, the way the light looked. I can't unsee it in my mind. I had spent weeks preparing for a major investor pitch, poring over slides, analytics, and projections until I could recite them in my sleep. This meeting wasn't just important. It had the potential to change everything. If successful, it would mean a huge cash injection that could scale our business to the next level. More developers, expanded features, full market outreach. Normally, Luke would have been right beside me. We were a package deal. He was the face, the pitch man, the guy who could charm investors into emptying their pockets. I'd take care of the technical nitty-gritty while he sold the dream. But this time, when I asked him to join me, he shrugged it off. "You've got this," he said casually, barely glancing up from his phone. I blinked, confused. Mia chimed in as if on cue. "We're just buried in internal stuff, budget cleanup and some onboarding planning. You'll do great on your own." And felt wrong. Luke loved pitching. It was his element, his favorite arena. And Mia? She never passed up a chance to over-prepare. Normally, she'd stay up with me running simulations, stress testing every detail. But this time, they were distant, dismissive, as if this pitch, this opportunity, didn't really matter. Despite the knot forming in my gut, I let it go. The presentation was too important to mess up. I told myself their behavior could wait to be unpacked later. Right now, I have to lock in. So I walked into that boardroom alone, palms slightly sweaty, adjusting my tie more than once. The presentation went better than I could have hoped. The investors were engaged, nodding along, asking all the right questions. By the time I wrapped up, one of them leaned back and said, "Let's make this happen." I had secured the funding. We finally had the capital to scale. It was everything we'd worked for. I should have felt on top of the world, but as I stepped out of the building, the thrill of success evaporated into that same gnawing unease. Why weren't Mia and Luke more involved? Why did it feel like I'd pitched not for us, but for me? I decided to find out. Determined to share the good news in person and maybe get to the bottom of their recent behavior, I swung by their favorite coffee shop. I ordered 3 lattes and a box of pastries. Their favorites, just like old times. I imagined walking into the office and watching their faces light up as I told them about the investment. We'd high-five, maybe even pop some sparkling cider in celebration. We'd built this company together. I wanted us to celebrate this win as a team. When I got to the office, the lights were dim, and the place felt unusually still. I pushed open the door with the coffee tray, balanced in my hands, and called out, "Hey, you won't believe it. We got the funding." No reply. I figured they might be in the conference room, their preferred spot for what Mia often called deep dives. I walked toward it, my footsteps oddly loud in the silence. As I neared the door, I heard their voices. Laughter. But it wasn't the kind you'd expect during a budget review. It was soft, flirtatious. The kind of laughter that carries undertones, shared looks, and unspoken understanding. I froze. My heart pounded as I stood outside the door, hand hovering just inches from the handle. Part of me hoped, prayed, that I was misinterpreting things, that I'd walk in and find a whiteboard full of diagrams, a laptop screen with spreadsheets, just a team working late. But that knot in my stomach refused to loosen. I opened the door. There they were. Mia sat far too close to Luke, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. Her posture wasn't professional. It was intimate, personal. The way she tilted her head toward him, the softness in her expression. It was like watching strangers. Not my wife. Not my best friend. They froze. Their faces went pale like teenagers caught sneaking out. Mia stood up abruptly, brushing imaginary wrinkles from her shirt, avoiding my eyes completely. "We weren't expecting you," she stammered. "Thought you'd still be at the pitch." "I wrapped up early," I replied, stepping fully into the room and setting the coffee and pastries on the table. My hands trembled, but I kept my voice steady. "Thought we could celebrate." Luke cleared his throat. "Man, that's awesome. Congrats. We were just discussing next steps." The lies spilled out so smoothly that it made me sick. The scene was burned into my memory, their guilt, the panic in Mia's eyes, Luke trying too hard to seem casual. I didn't need explanations, not anymore. The truth had already slapped me in the face. We'd built a dream together, the three of us. But in that room, I realized I'd been the only one who still believed in it. And the betrayal? It cut deeper than I thought possible. I didn't explode. I didn't accuse or demand answers. I simply looked at them, two people I would have trusted with my life, and saw them for who they really were. And in that moment I knew they'd already made their choice. As I stood in that conference room, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't the relief of clarity. It was the numbness of acceptance. The air between us crackled with everything unspoken. I could see the panic in their eyes, the frantic calculations behind their expressions, trying to figure out what I knew, what I had seen, and what I might do next. But I didn't give them the satisfaction of a confrontation, not then. Instead, I walked out. I left them in that room, stunned and silent, coffee cooling untouched on the table. My heart pounded in my chest, but my face remained expressionless. I didn't need them to see the storm raging inside me. They didn't deserve to. In that moment I knew that whatever came next, however painful or difficult, I wouldn't be the one left broken. They made their choices. Now, I was going to make mine. I did my best to stay composed, to keep my movements slow and calm as I stepped further into the room. I thought I'd bring you guys some good news, I said, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask than anything genuine. They didn't say a word. They just stared at me, their silence louder and more damning than any outburst could have been. My gaze shifted between them. Mia standing stiffly, Luke shifting uncomfortably, both of them caught like deer in headlights. "What's going on?" I asked again, firmer this time. My voice cut through the tension like a blade. Mia exchanged a glance with Luke. It was brief, but full of meaning. One of those silent communications that only people deeply entangled could share. She let out a long sigh, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her own secret was finally too much to carry. "Look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to slice the air. "This isn't how we wanted you to find out." Those words made my stomach sink. "Find out what?" I asked, though deep down, the pieces were already aligning in my mind. The late nights, the private texts, the laughter that wasn't meant for me. I knew. I just needed to hear them say it. And they did. They admitted everything. Mia spoke first. She explained how they'd been seeing each other for months. It started with late-night meetings that turned into dinners, then secret rendezvous under the pretense of project deadlines. She said it wasn't planned, that it just happened. Her voice trembled, but not in a way that conveyed regret. It sounded too polished, too ready, like she'd rehearsed every line in front of a mirror. Luke jumped in, his tone defensive yet oddly detached. "It's complicated, man. We didn't mean for it to get this far. We didn't want to hurt you." I stood motionless. The word complicated echoed in my mind like a bad joke. That's what they were going with. Mia looked down at her hands, wringing them nervously. "I'm not saying this to be cruel, but I've felt for a while like we've been drifting. You're always so locked into the technical stuff, into the business. And with Luke, it's just different. We connect in ways I don't with you anymore." Her words struck like ice. She wasn't just confessing to infidelity, she was dismantling our relationship piece by piece, painting it like some forgotten relic, an outdated code base she'd moved on from. Luke nodded like they were reading from the same script. "We didn't plan for this, man, the more time we spent together, the more it became clear." Mia continued, voice soft but steady. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. I still care about you, but not like before." My chest felt tight, like all the air had been vacuumed out of the room. This wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. They were rewriting our history as if it had never mattered. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab Luke by the collar and ask him how he could do this to me, to us. He wasn't just a friend, he was family. He'd stood by my side through every milestone in life. He was there the day I got engaged, the day we launched the company, the day we moved into our first office. And now he stood there, looking at me like a stranger, as if everything we'd built together could be tossed aside for some impulsive affair. Instead, I stood frozen. "Is that all?" I asked finally, my voice cold, hollow. It didn't even sound like me. They exchanged one last glance, almost like they were debating whether to say more. Finally, Mia whispered, "I'm sorry." Luke gave a slight nod. "Yeah, man, We didn't want it to come out like this. I stared at him, my former best friend, my business partner, the guy who once swore we'd build an empire together. The betrayal hit again like a second punch. His remorse felt shallow, like he was sorry I walked in, not for what he'd done. I didn't respond. I just stared, silent. There was nothing left to say. My silence was louder than anything I could have shouted. Then I looked at Mia. Her head was bowed, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sleeve. She couldn't even meet my eyes. These were the two people I trusted more than anyone, and they'd torn the ground out from under me. Without another word, I turned and walked out. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't. Every inch of that apartment was a reminder of what used to be, now tainted with lies and betrayal. I checked into a hotel, dropped my bag on the floor, and sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at nothing. The next morning, I filed for divorce. No fights, no ultimatums. I didn't argue for the apartment, for my share of the company, not even for an explanation. Let them have it all. Let them choke on it. Because that's what they were expecting? That I'd lose my mind, tear everything down, make a scene? But I didn't. My calm unsettled them. They were waiting for fire, and I gave them silence. That's what confused them the most. But behind that silence, a plan was already forming. I wasn't going to stoop to their level. No shouting matches, no smear campaigns, no messy social fallout. Instead, I'd rebuild, quietly, efficiently, the way I'd always worked. Let my actions speak, not my anger. Losing Mia hurt. Losing Luke gutted me. But what they did together. And now, they could live with that choice. For weeks, I replayed every moment, every ignored red flag, every sudden cancellation, every time they shut me out of their inside jokes. I should have seen it coming, but hindsight was a cruel friend. The divorce was quick, clean. I packed what little I wanted to keep and moved to a new city. Not to escape, but to start again. My new apartment was small, nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom with a desk, a couch, and a view of a quiet street. But it was mine. No shared memories clinging to the furniture, no whispers of betrayal in the walls. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. I kept my head down and focused on the basics. I spent my days freelancing, taking on tech projects to keep myself afloat, and my nights rebuilding, both myself and something new. I didn't know what my next venture would be, but I knew it wouldn't involve anyone who had broken my trust. Word got around eventually. Friends called, confused. Some took sides, some stayed neutral, others disappeared. But I didn't waste energy chasing closure or validation. I let the silence speak for me. I never confronted them again, never responded to the one awkward email Luke sent weeks later, or the short, empty "I hope you're okay" text Mia fired off from a number I eventually blocked. I didn't need their explanation. They had taken enough from me. But they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my grit, my passion, or my ability to rise from the ashes. So I got to work. When I started planning the next chapter, one where I would win, not by revenge, but by success. Quiet, steady, and undeniable. I didn't have a roadmap, no blueprint for healing, just the faint, fragile hope that putting some distance between myself and the wreckage might help me breathe again. After leaving behind everything, I landed in a city where no one knew my name. The first apartment I found was a cramped studio tucked in a rundown part of town, the kind of place where you hear arguments through the paper-thin walls, and hot water is more of a suggestion than a guarantee. The furniture? Barely functional. A twin-size mattress I'd dragged in myself sat on the floor, and a folding table doubled as both a desk and dining surface. I had one chair, a wobbly thing I'd salvaged from a pile of furniture left on the curb. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No reminders, no ghosts. To keep the lights on, I picked up a job at a local coffee shop. The pay was minimum wage, just enough to afford groceries and utilities if I stretched things. Most days I spent behind the counter steaming lattes, wiping tables, and trying not to think too much. But when my shift ended and the cafe lights dimmed, I went home, pulled out my aging laptop, and lost myself in code. The code was the only thing that still made sense. In the blur of betrayal and heartache, logic remained clean, predictable, and fully in my control, and buried in that clarity was an idea I'd once tried to pitch. An idea I couldn't stop thinking about. Back when Luke and I were still partners, I'd quietly started working on a concept on the side. It was simple at first, a way to help small businesses integrate mobile payments more efficiently. Fast setup, no complicated onboarding, and scalable with growth. I believed in it so much that I even emailed it to Luke, thinking it might be a perfect addition to our startup's offerings. His reply came quickly, and it stung. Too niche, too risky, not worth the resources. It wasn't just the dismissal, it was how carelessly he brushed it off, like it wasn't even worth discussing. I shelved the idea, but I never truly let it go. That cold email lived in the back of my mind, whispering doubts and daring me to prove him wrong. Now, with no team to consult, no investors to placate, and nothing left to lose, I pulled the idea out of the shadows and gave it everything I had. Night after night, I hunched over my second-hand laptop, the glow of the screen lighting up my tiny apartment. The code poured out of me like therapy. This app, this vision, it became my lifeline. I imagined something that didn't just work. It empowered small businesses, gave them tools they usually couldn't afford. It had to be intuitive, reliable, and accessible. And I was obsessed, not just with making it function, but with proving that I had seen something valuable when no one else had. That first year was nothing short of brutal. I survived on instant noodles and whatever pastries the coffee shop staff handed off at closing. I rarely slept. My days were filled with cappuccinos and burnt espresso shots, and my nights were a blur of lines of code, stubborn bugs, and caffeine-fueled breakthroughs. I didn't tell anyone what I was building, not at first. It felt safer that way, keeping it in a cocoon where no one could judge it, steal it, or tell me it wouldn't work. But eventually I realized I needed help. I reached out to a few old connections in the tech community, people I trusted, people who had no ties to Mia or Luke. I pitched them my idea as best I could, fumbling through my nerves and trying to sound confident. To my surprise, a few of them saw the potential. They offered feedback, encouragement, and eventually, support. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. The growth was slow at first. Glitches, delays, pivots, I faced them all. There were nights I sat staring at the screen, wondering if I was wasting my time, but I never quit. And then, almost out of nowhere, things started to click. A few local businesses picked it up. They liked how easy it was to use, how affordable it was compared to bloated competitors. Word of mouth did what marketing budgets couldn't. One shop told another, then another. My user base started to grow. What had begun as a passion project was morphing into a real platform. And somewhere along the way, I stopped checking in on Mia and Luke. Early on, I used to hate squall their Instagram posts late at night. They were still running the startup, attending swanky tech events, posing for pictures like the betrayal never happened. One caption burned itself into my memory, making moves. The audacity. But the busier I got, the less I cared. Their world didn't matter anymore. Mine was growing, thriving. By the time my platform started generating revenue, I barely remembered to check what they were up to. I hired a small but driven team, people who believed in the mission. We worked out of a shared co-working space, eating takeout, building updates, chasing bugs. And then came recognition. Tech blogs picked up on our growth. A few niche publications ran features on how we were changing the game for small businesses. Then came the invites, conferences, panels, podcasts. I, the guy who once slept on a floor and poured coffee for minimum wage, was suddenly being called a thought leader. It was surreal. Of course, I knew they must have heard. Luke and Mia couldn't have missed it, and as it turned out, they hadn't. That truth came in the form of a desperate, almost pitiful email. From Luke. At first, I thought it was spam. The subject line was vague, something like, "Hey, long time." But curiosity got the better of me. I clicked, and there it was. A long, meandering email, filled with regret, excuses, and poorly disguised desperation. Luke's tone was a far cry from the cocky confidence he once wore like armor. He wrote about how things had gone south quickly after I left. The startup was no longer thriving, their product launches were flopping, investors had started pulling out, morale was low, revenue was lower, and then, the bombshell. He'd been pushed out by the board. It would have been poetic if it hadn't been so pathetic. Toward the end of the message, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned seeing a job listing, a software role at a promising tech startup, mine. He had no idea it was my company. The irony was almost laughable. He ended with a request to chat, claiming he just wanted to catch up and maybe explore opportunities. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. The kid who once dismissed my ideas, who betrayed me for his own gain, was now unknowingly asking me for a lifeline. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My company's name said everything that needed to be said. To the same name from that pitch he once rejected. They called him the same name he called too niche. The same name I'd built from the ground up while they were busy living out their curated, picture-perfect fantasy. And now that name was known across the industry. I closed the email, archived it, and went back to work. There was still so much left to build. The emails landed in my inbox like ghosts from a past I thought I'd buried. Luke's message came first. Professional on the surface, but laced with desperation. He talked up his extensive experience and how he believed his unique insight could help drive innovation. He was throwing his hat in the ring for a role at my company without even realizing who owned it. Mere hours later, Mia's email appeared. Hers had a different tone, soaked in nostalgia and regret. She didn't outright ask for a job. Instead, she wrote about how much she'd grown, how she'd learned from past mistakes, and how it might be nice to meet for coffee, catch up, and maybe discuss future possibilities. It was vague, careful, and carefully manipulative. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, half amused, half disgusted. After all this time, years of silence, of betrayal, of pretending I didn't exist, they were crawling back, looking for a lifeline. The irony was rich. Classic. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I forwarded both emails to HR with a brief note. Schedule them for the open junior support specialist role. The job wasn't glamorous. Entry level, customer support, basic troubleshooting. A far cry from the executive seats they once occupied beside me. But it was real work, and I wanted to see if they were truly ready to do it. When the interview day arrived, I dressed sharp, kept my demeanor calm, and waited in the room where we usually held internal hiring rounds. I didn't tell anyone they were coming. I wanted it to be a surprise. I checked my watch as the door opened, and there they were, walking side by side like the power couple they once thought they were. But the moment their eyes landed on me sitting at the head of the table, everything changed. Luke froze. The confident smirk he always wore vanished. Mia's breath caught audibly, and she looked like she wished the floor would swallow her whole. "Luke." "Mia," I said, nodding toward the chairs across from me. "Thanks for coming in." They exchanged a quick, stunned glance before slowly sitting down. The silence stretched for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then Duke said, "We must move forward." I bend down beside him before I connect, ducking in a slight. "So," I said casually, leaning back in my chair, "let's talk about the position." Luke, ever the fast talker, tried to regain control first. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Well," I replied, letting the words hang, "it's my company. I like to stay involved." Mia avoided my eyes, her fingers nervously fiddling with the corner of her portfolio. I kept the tone strictly professional, walking them through the job responsibilities. Responding to support tickets, resolving customer complaints, and escalating technical issues to the engineering team. The role required patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to start at the bottom. They were still too stunned to interrupt. I could practically hear the gears grinding in their heads, trying to process what was happening. Eventually, Luke cleared his throat and tried to salvage some dignity. "This position seems a bit lower level than I expected," he said cautiously. I raised an eyebrow and nodded slowly, pretending to consider it. "Oh? Well, based on your resume and the trajectory of your last company, this seemed like an appropriate fit. Unless, of course, you feel it's not a good match?" Mia finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were hoping for something more aligned with our previous experience." "Ah," I said with a sympathetic nod, "I understand. Unfortunately, we don't have any executive-level openings at this time, but this position could be a great opportunity to, rebuild." The word wasn't accidental. Mia flinched slightly. Luke's jaw tightened. For someone who always had a comeback ready, his silence now was deafening. The rest of the interview was a train wreck. Their answers were vague, unprepared, and clearly improvised. Luke stumbled over even basic questions about customer service scenarios. Mia kept looking to him for answers, her usual sharpness nowhere to be found. When it was over, I stood, shook their hands, and said with a smile, "Thanks for coming in. We'll let you know." They left in silence. That night, I got an email from Luke. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't even civil. It was a rant, long-winded, angry, and dripping with entitlement. He accused me of using the interview to humiliate him, of nursing some petty grudge, and of being ungrateful for the opportunities he'd once given me. Then came the most outrageous part. He claimed he had helped come up with the core idea for my app, and that he was entitled to compensation. I read the email twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Luke, the same man who once dismissed my pitch with a single sentence, "Too niche, too risky," was now trying to claim credit for it. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I opened my old email archives and searched for the message chain from years ago, the one where I'd first outlined the payment app idea. It didn't take long to find. There it was, my original pitch, dated and time-stamped, and right beneath it, Luke's response, a curt dismissal, mocking the concept for being too small, too risky, not scalable. The receipts were crystal clear. I saved everything into a neat PDF folder, just in case. Apparently just in case wasn't a hypothetical. A week later, I received notice that Luke was suing me. That's right. After failing the interview, sending an angry email, and burning what little goodwill he had left, he actually filed a lawsuit claiming partial ownership of the company I'd built. The gall of it was staggering. His claim? That he'd contributed to the initial idea and therefore deserved a cut of the profits. He even tried to cite vague meetings we had years ago as proof of collaboration. It was laughable, but I didn't take it lightly. I came prepared. My legal team compiled the original email chain, development logs, design drafts, and even timestamps from the earliest GitHub commits. I showed the court that not only was the idea mine, I'd been working on it long before I ever left the old startup. Luke had never contributed a single line of code, document, or note related to the concept. When the judge read Luke's so-called evidence, they barely concealed their annoyance. The verdict came faster than I expected, so quick it felt like a mercy ruling. I won. Cleanly, without question. Luke walked out of that courtroom red-faced and empty-handed. Worse, he was now responsible for court fees, legal penalties, and whatever debt he'd racked up trying to chase a payday that never belonged to him. Mia never reached out again. I don't know what happened between them after that, and frankly, I don't care. All I know is this: sometimes karma doesn't just knock on your door, it shows up wearing a suit, armed with facts, and delivers justice with a signature. And I didn't have to lift a finger, just let the truth speak for itself.